A lot of times when people go on trips, they'll record in a journal what they did that day, where they stopped, what the hotel was like. I know Jeannie has done something similar in the past on the occasional trip that we've been on. Not every time, but occasionally. I think when she was in Mexico, she kept a journal of places where she had been. And a lot of people have done that in history. Lewis and Clark in their expedition out west, they kept a log of where they were and what it was like. And maybe you've done something similar also where you had a travel diary. Well, here in Numbers chapter 33, we have a travel diary of the Israelites. And it's super impressive because it's over a 40-year period. You know, a lot of people just aren't that consistent with how they kept track of where they were and what they did. I just wanted to show you a map of the journey from Egypt to Israel, going down. Let's see, going down and around. And then right around here in the wilderness of Zin and Kadesh Barnea, they were there for the bulk of the 40 years, going around and back and forth, and they weren't allowed into the promised land because of their disobedience. And then finally, they do get in. But that's the travel log. But we're going to look at it in Numbers chapter 33. We pick up the action in the first verse. The stages in Israel's journey. Hi, June. Hi, Lori. Hi, Jeannie. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Verse 1, here are the stages in the journey of the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt by divisions. And this goes to show you how carefully documented Moses kept all the records, that we have an amazing record of what went on during those 40 years. Under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Verse 2, at the Lord's command, Moses recorded the stages in their journey. Hi, Barb. This is their journey by stages. Verse 3, the Israelites set out from Ramses in Egypt on the 15th day of the first month, the day after the Passover. They marched out defiantly in full view of all the Egyptians. Remember in Leviticus 26, verse 12 and 13, God enabled Israel to walk out of Egypt with heads held high. And they walked out defiantly. No more being slaves for 430 years. No more being whipped by the foreman of Pharaoh. God is leading us out in full view of the Egyptians. Verse 4, who were burying all their firstborn. You picture the scene. Israel defiantly marching out of the promised land. But in the background you hear weeping and sniffling and mourning as people are digging holes in the ground for the burial of their dead. What a scene. And Israel is walking out with their heads held high, not because they're glad of what's happening to the Egyptians, but because they know. They have known nothing but tears and sorrow for 400 years. They know about that stuff. And now God is leading them out. Verse 4, the Lord had struck down those firstborn among the Egyptians, for the Lord had brought judgment on their gods. You look back at all 10 plagues that came on the land of Egypt. Each one was a judgment on an Egyptian god. The first one, where Moses turned his staff into a snake, that one was a judgment on Pharaoh because the snake was the symbol on his headdress. And then the turning the Nile River into blood, that was a judgment on the Egyptian god of the Nile. God was saying, I am more powerful than all these fake gods. And then the last plague, the plague of the firstborn, that was a judgment of Almighty God on Pharaoh himself, because he was considered a god, and God showed power over him and his family. Well, verse 5, the Israelites left Ramses and camped at Sukhoth. They left Sukhoth and camped at Etham. By the way, the Hebrew word Sukhoth means tabernacle. So they left Egypt and they tabernacled at tabernacle. The whole Hebrew Bible is like that, playing on words. I like to joke around and make plays on words and things like that. Well, they did that a lot in the Bible, in the original language. Verse 6, they left Sukkoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. They left Etham, turned back to Pi Hahiroth to the east of Baal Zephon. I mean, these cities are nowhere near Fond du Lac or Potter, but there's a whole record of them. It's amazing. And they left Pi Hahiroth and passed through the sea into the desert. That's when they went through the Red Sea. And when they had traveled for 3 days, they camped at Marah. Marah means bitterness. That's where the water had been bitter, but God made it sweet so that they can drink. They left Marah and went to Elam, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and then they camped there. And then in verses 10 all the way through verse 49, we see every single place they camped at over the 40 years. Verse 10, they left Elam and camped by the Red Sea. Verse 11, they left the Red Sea, camped in the desert of Sin. They left the desert of Sin and camped at Dufka. That's verse 12. Well, I want to get to the part where it talks about Kadesh Barnea. Verse 36, they left Ezion Geber and camped at Kadesh in the desert of Zin. That's in Numbers 14, where they got in big trouble for complaining against God. He brought them on the precipice of the promised land, and they said, we can't go in there. The people are too big. They're too scary. They'll crush us like we're a bunch of ants. And Caleb and Joshua were like, no, man, God's got this. You just got to trust in the Lord. He'll help you overcome your giants. No, we can't do it. We should kill Moses and get another leader and go back to Egypt. And that's when God said, all right, you're not getting into the promised land. You just, you have no faith. You don't deserve it. All this happened while they were at Kadesh in verse 37. Verse 38, at the Lord's command, Aaron the priest went up to Mount Hor, where he died on the first day of the 5th month of the 40th year. So they hung out a long time in the desert by Kadesh. And I always think of the song, I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. In the desert, you can't remember your name, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain. Da-da. I always think of the Israelites in the desert. They can't remember their name. They've been there for 40 years. They're frustrated, they're flustered, they feel forgotten by God, and I can understand it. They were shaking their fist at God out there. Verse 40, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev of Canaan, heard that the Israelites were coming. It's the 40th year. God says, all right, I'm going to let you guys move again. The next generation, you can enter the promised land. And then the Israelites overcame them in battle. Verse 41, they left Mount Hor and camped at Zalmanah. Verse 42, they left Zalmanah and camped at Punan. And then it mentions a bunch of other places. And then verse 47, they left Almon to Bliathaim and camped in the mountains of Abarim near Nebo. They left the mountains of Abarim and camped on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. And that's where Moses is going to get ready to die. Verse 50, on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the Canaan area, drive out all the inhabitants of the land, destroy their carved images and their cast idols, and destroy their high places. Take possession of the land, settle in it. I've given it to you. It's yours. Distribute the land by lot according to your clans. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance. To a smaller group, a smaller one. Whatever falls to them by lot will be yours, or theirs. Verse 55, if you do not drive them out, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your side. Oh boy, I wish that wasn't in there, but that is in there, and that's exactly what happened. They didn't completely drive out the idolatrous, murderous Canaanites. And they stayed in there, and they were thorns in the side of the Israelites all through the generations, leading them astray into the worship of false gods. They will give you trouble in the land where you will live, and then I will do to you what I plan to do to them. There's no such thing as part-time obedience. You're either obedient or you're not. Can you imagine marrying somebody and then asking them if they'll be faithful to you, and they say, well, I think I could be 85% faithful? You'd be like, 85% faithful is like 0% faithful. You're either faithful or you're not. I want all in, 100%. And I think the Israelites didn't quite get that. And God said, I'm going to do to you what I plan to do to them if you're not 100% faithful. And people sometimes say, oh, the Old Testament is so harsh, advocating for the complete destruction of Canaanite civilizations that have been there for hundreds of years. Let me tell you something. Yeah, they've been there for hundreds of years, killing babies for hundreds of years, waylaying nomadic travelers and strangers for hundreds of years, setting iron idols on fire, scalding hot, and putting babies into their arms, doing that kind of stuff for hundreds of years. When you look at it like that, how can you say, oh, it's so cruel that God is judging them? Nuh-uh. God was gracious to them for hundreds of years. And now it's time. And God is going to use the Israelites to execute judgment. He's got the right to do that. When you're playing chess and you've got the white pieces get to go first. You have the right, to make that first move. God's got the right. Yeah, he's the owner of the chessboard. He's got the right to make the moves that he wants to make to execute judgment. But anyways, what an amazingly detailed travel log. You look at some of the names in here. Verse 33, they left Hor Hagigad. I can't even say that hardly. Hor Hagigad and camped at Jotbathah. It's so much easier to say Potter. But an amazing story of how God brought them through and showed them grace even in spite of their stubbornness. Can you look back over your life and see how God has been gracious to you in spite of stubbornness or selfishness or idolatry? I think we all can. Sometimes I look behind me to see if I can see smoke. But we need to thank God today for showing us grace over the last years and decades of our lives, and ask God to make us 100% obedient and 100% devoted to Him rather than 85%. Well, Jesus loves you. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. We'll be back tomorrow for Numbers chapter 34. You guys have a great day and God bless. Hi, Beverly.